Good day, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the Meet the Grantmakers online. We are so pleased to have you join us. I'm coming to you live from Los Angeles, so this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world, we welcome you. If this is your first time joining us for the Meet the Grantmakers panel, we welcome you. If if this is your return time, we welcome you back. Thank you for being here. So the Meet the Grantmakers panel, we host them quarterly, so 4 times a year. And we invite an illustrious panel of grant makers to come and be in dialogue and conversation about all things around program planning and proposal submission. So today we have a wonderful panel, and I'm looking forward to introducing them. Before we get started, I want to thank our other sponsors. We have Grant Station, as well as Foundant Technologies and the Grantsmanship Center. I am a senior trainer here at the Grantsmanship Center, where we provide grant services for the over 50 years now, if you can believe it. So on behalf of the Grantsmanship Center and all of our sponsors, we welcome you. A few things of housekeeping. Yes, we are recording this webinar. So since you are registered and you are here, you will automatically receive a follow-up email with the recording. In addition, closed captioning is available. So if you need that, you could just click down at the bottom and the closed captioning will come up for you. So I want to make a transition and introduce our panelists. I'm going to first introduce them and you'll see them, and then I'm going to ask them to do a longer introduction about what makes their foundation unique, any priorities that they have, etc. And so, and then also you can start dropping your questions. So thank you all so much for sending your questions in advance. We'll also take some live questions to get a nice dialogue. So I'm going to start with Sushma Raman. She is the president and CEO of the Heising-Simons Foundation in Los Altos and San Francisco. So welcome, Sushma. And then next up, we have Chanel Ford. She is the director of programs at the Native American Agricultural Fund in Bismarck, North Dakota. And last but definitely not least, we have Brandon Zeigler. He is the Chief Impact Officer and VP of Grants and Initiatives at the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro in North Carolina. So welcome, all of you. Thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to start with introductions, as I mentioned. So you each will have 5 to 10 minutes to share a little bit more in detail about your foundation, in particular, what makes you unique. As we share at all of these grantmaker panels, we always say, if you know one grantmaker, you know exactly one, because in some ways even though you all do giving, you do that in a very different way and with different set of priorities, as well as you're organized differently. And so I'm going to start with you, Sushma, to just share a little bit about your foundation, what makes you unique, any priorities or new initiatives that you'd like to share with our audience.
Terrific. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm Sushma Raman. I have been at the Heising-Simons Foundation for the past year. I'm the president and CEO. I think what makes us unique is that we are a family foundation, and we support work in a long-standing way in areas of concern to the family, advancing scientific research, addressing the impact of climate change, focusing on the early education needs of our youngest learners, and addressing human rights concerns in the United States with a focus on immigrant detention and mass incarceration. We also have smaller initiatives focused on local grant making in the Bay Area, as well as a journalism program. And since I have joined, we've launched a small initiative focused on the impact of technology and society. I think our values on our website, really, are emblematic of what the foundation strives to work in partnership with a sense of humility, with a spirit of collaboration, and really sort of thinking about how do we unlock opportunity, knowledge, and possibilities for those who we are in partnership with. So I'm happy to answer more questions about the foundation when we have our conversation, but I'm also happy to speak more broadly about trends in philanthropy, given my prior work at other private independent foundations, such as Ford and the Open Society Foundation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome. And Chanel.
I'm the Director of Programs for the Native American Agriculture Fund. I've been here for about 2.5 years. I'm a Spokane tribal member, born and raised on the Spokane Indian Reservation in Wellpinit, Washington. And what we do at NAF, I think, is really unique. So we're a private charitable trust, and we actually derive from the Keep Siegel v. Vilsack class action litigation. We are a drawdown trust, so we have about 20 years of funding, and we disperse all of these funds out to Native American farmers and ranchers. So our goal is to really assist the original claimants and those that have experienced the same harms as the original claimants of that Keep Siegel v. Vilsack litigation. So history-wise, Native farmers and ranchers were not being afforded the same rights when it came to access to capital, loan opportunities, and so the litigation ensued. Our main focus is looking at ways to enhance agriculture in tribal communities, and we fund CDFIs, so Community Development Financial Institutions. We fund educational institutions, we fund tribes and instrumentalities, and we fund nonprofit organizations. We are in our 6th year of funding right now, actually. Our RFA is open. We close on May 1st, so just right around the corner. NAF was created to kick off their grant funds in 2019, and we have had successful grant applicants and projects and programming from Maine to Florida to North Dakota to Washington State and to Louisiana, and it's really exciting the work that we get to do. And prior to this, I was in a role that was with a smaller nonprofit organization called Spokane Tribal Network, and we focused on strategic action plan building and suicide prevention in tribal communities. So I'm joining today, I think, in a dual capacity of now I'm on the backside of things where I get to review grants that come into our organization. But I've also been on the latter part of that as a small nonprofit that was writing the applications and praying to get the funding. And this opportunity that you all are providing, I think, is fantastic and a great tool that I wish I would have utilized when I was in my previous role. So excited to be on this panel today and with the other amazing colleagues, and just really looking forward to conversations and questions that y'all might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Chanel. And Brandon.
Thank you for having me. My name is Brandon, and I have had the good luck of attending wonderful education institutions and working for some amazing organizations in finance and philanthropy. And I am a living example of economic mobility. And I stand on the shoulders of family members, especially my mother, who at times worked 2 and 3 jobs to ensure that my education, my hopes, and my dreams were supported. Currently, I serve as the Chief Impact Officer at the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro, and I have the great privilege of investing capital across a spectrum of impact that creates pathways to economic mobility for people and communities who've been denied opportunities. With a specific focus on Greensboro and Guilford County, we're not only deploying nonprofit grant capital, but we're also thinking about how we use our endowment and our investments locally to spur more urgent change. Really thinking about how do we create velocity when it comes to economic mobility, when it comes to access to health, healthcare, when it comes to thinking about how we use arts and culture to bridge divides and bring people together. So I have the great pleasure of working with a wonderful team, an organization with a great outlook in the future, and excited to be with you all today.
Wonderful. Thank you. I like that phrase, to create some velocity. I like that. All right. So the questions are starting to come in. So just a reminder to our audience out there, we're going to start with some of the questions that you all submitted. 80 people submitted questions in advance. So we're going to start with some of those, and the rest of you start dropping your questions in the chat, and we'll go back and forth between, the questions we received and the live questions. Okay, so jumping right in, I'm going to start with a question that we get all the time. Oftentimes, as Chanel, as you mentioned, a lot of times we get new grant seekers that come to this panel as an introduction to either the Grantsmanship Center or some of our partners or the field of nonprofit, and they see an opportunity to hear from funders, and they want to know, as a new organization, maybe an organization that doesn't have 3 to 5 years of a track record to show, but they've been doing some great impact in the community. What is the best way to approach your particular foundation, and how does your foundation view new organizations? And I recognize you all do, applications and processes a little bit different. So I'm going to start with you, Sushma, and then I'll kind of go through the panel. And again, we can make this more of a dialogue. So I'll ask the question, but anybody can jump in at any time.
Yeah, that's a great question, Angela. And I'll get us started with some preliminary thoughts, and I'll reinforce what you said earlier, which is that each foundation is different in terms of how people approach grant making. So I would say look at your peer organizations. Who are the organizations you collaborate with or who have aligned missions? Who's funding them? Are there people on your board who can open doors to corporate or foundation donors? Are there people in the community who you've worked with in prior organizations who can help you with that, right? Are there local community foundations that you could reach out to? So starting with that sort of landscape assessment of the groups you work with, as well as the people you know, can be a really helpful starting point if you are a relatively new organization.
Brilliant. Chanel?
Yeah, I would have to agree with Sushma. I think that's a great note to have, is doing your research, do some outreach, see what best would fit for your organization or the work that you're doing or trying to do. For our organization specifically, we are only able to fund Native. Well, let me preface it this way. You don't have to be a Native organization to apply for our funding. However, if you're a non-Native organization applying for our funds, the demographic you serve has to be primarily Native American. But we do get a lot of questions that come in. Email the grants email that they've got listed on websites, follow the newsletters, ask the questions. Somebody should get back to you. Us in particular, if we can't fund your institution or organization or business, what we tend to do is pass you off to somebody we know, like Sushma mentioned. We like to do a soft handoff to an organization that we might know of that is looking to fund types of projects or organizations that you work for. We're always happy to do that. And we have a lot of connections outside of Indian country. We have a really great relationship with the Farm Bureau that is not Native led, but they do agriculture in a bigger aspect. So happy to pass on resources that we have. As long as those questions come up, we're happy to connect people.
Great. Thank you so much. There's a couple of questions that have been coming in just about, what qualifies, and do you have to be, just for you specifically, Chanel, about, a Native Hawaiian education program and what your parameters are in terms of the kinds of organizations and what qualifies. So maybe you could just take a moment and clarify that for the audience.
Yeah, so we actually do fund a Native Hawaiian organizations. We have, I think, about 6 to 8 grantees right now, and we're actually doing a site visit with two of our grantees in Hawaii. One's a CDFI and one's a nonprofit organization. In terms of educational institutions, you could be creating a specific agriculture program that will be distributed. It will be based off of, say, it's Native Hawaiian traditional work, and it's geared towards that, and it's able, Native Hawaiian students are able to participate in this program, that's something that you would potentially be able to apply for, and we would look to fund. We have a lot of Q&A on our website too, so feel free to go to nativeamericanagriculturefund.org to answer those very specific questions. I know we are on a limited time here, so I'll just flag that. But yes, we do fund Native Hawaiians, and we have several projects, and looking to fund more too in the future.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing that up. I want to let everybody know that in addition to this wonderful live panel, we have put together profiles of all of the funders. Some of you are sending in very, very specific questions like, where's the contact information? Who's the program officer? All of that stuff is on the website and listed on the profile. So make sure you go and check that out. So thank you for that. Brandon, let's go back to you in terms of new organizations and what are some of the ways, some strategies for approaching your particular foundation that you all engage and use?
Thank you, Angela. Chanel and Sushma have talked a little bit about mission, vision, alignment, strategy, and reach and outreach. A lot of this work is really relational. I think back to my first days as a program officer, and I took the mentality of I would take any meeting, period, because you never know who you will run into, who knows the right person, who's doing some amazing work somewhere. And while that made for busy days, I really was able to build strong relationships with a multitude of people. So for me, this work is very relational. Cold outreach is great, but as colleagues have said, if you have a warm introduction, that's important. But I think take the time to get to know the program officer, take the time to get to know the grant maker and the organization. One of the things I always say is not all money is good money. So make sure you're doing the diligence to understand if you want to partner with that organization, because the work we do here is very partner oriented. We want to make sure that we have a deeply sustaining relationship that lasts for a while. So I can't emphasize enough how relational this work is, especially when it comes to alignment, and be persistent. But many of our colleagues in the field are very busy people, and sometimes it takes a while, unfortunately. So be persistent and make sure your outreach is strong and really seek to build those relationships. A number of times I've met somebody and come to get to know them over several months, even over a year, and then figured out how they fit into a strategy and then pursued them and asked them to partner with us. It happens quite often. So that relationship aspect is really important to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that topic up because that is also, I think if new organizations is the first topic, building relationship is the second. I think, new grant seekers, seasoned grant seekers, that this is just a field and a topic, a sector where relationship building is something we talk about all the time. And I want to go into that conversation a little bit further. And what does that look like or mean? And maybe you could even start with a ways that you've seen it, either you've been involved or you've seen it go really successfully, like anecdotally, or any practical tips. I think, so Brandon, I am going to start with you again, just because you brought the topic up, and then I'll go through the lot of you. But I also know, Sushma, one of the things I'd love for you to address, because I believe your foundation doesn't accept unsolicited proposals, but it says on the website that the staff is always looking at conferences and meeting people. So if you could address that in your comments, if you could address that from, I think even the Ford Foundation doesn't accept unsolicited proposals. So in your career, how have you seen that relationship working with those kind of foundations? I'd love if you could address that. But Brandon, I'm gonna, since you brought it up, I'm gonna ask you to riff on that topic a little bit more.
Definitely. When I first started in philanthropy with the Walton Family Foundation, my first supervisor, Caleb Offley, said, I remember day one said something that still rings true to me. There are two types of program officers. One is that sit behind the desk, and those that are out in the community, out seeking those opportunities. And he asked me that day, first hour, like, which one do you want to be? And I told him I was going to be out in the community, right? And so you have program officers who make it a point to be out in the space, in the ecosystem, building those relationships. Whether they accept proposals or all their work is unsolicited. At the Community Foundation here, we have dual tracks. So we have some strategies that are unsolicited, and we go seek those people we want to partner with. And that's really that external work where, my team is out making sure they're vetting and meeting as many people as possible, both locally and nationally. And then we also have an RFP process, an open call that folks can apply to as well. But I think, a part of that outreach is really just understanding the organization, understanding the portfolio that program officer, that grant maker manages, and really understanding what alignment looks like, asking critical questions, really digging into the strategy, really, centering your own expertise with somebody who has lived experience that's impacting that work, and really articulating that to the grant maker really well so they understand what you're doing, how you're doing it, and can start to really conceptualize what the fit looks like. So for me, a lot of that relationship building is finding people, whether they're sitting behind a desk or if they're out externally in the ecosystem, and then really trying to figure out what's your message you're conveying and how you're describing the work, and really fit in alignment that would really help them with those conditions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sushma?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. I do think there are a lot of foundations that accept proposals through an open search process, while there are others that do it through more resourcing and sourcing from existing grantees. So if it's the latter case, I would recommend looking at the grants website, looking at who you're working with that is being funded by those foundations that you're looking to break into, and looking for opportunities for either collaboration or partnership as appropriate. Very often funders will also refer to other funders who are looking for funding sources and say, hey, I'm funding so-and-so, and I highly recommend them. And that's another way to think about how to get access to funders who don't accept unsolicited proposals.
That's great. I always say to the classes when I'm doing training, I'm like, don't think about funders as like an ATM machine. But, even if you're not getting funding from them, the relationship, the people that they're connected to can always be just another source if we open up the scope of how we think about our funding partners. Thank you for that. Chanel, how about you and your organization?
I think Sushma and Brandon really hit it on the head, to be completely honest. I would have to fully agree with both, and don't have anything else really to add. Great job. Great job. The perks of answering last, I guess.
That's great. Okay, perfect. Well, this time I'm going to start with you on this next question. So this is coming in as a live question, and there's a lot of very specific questions for the different panelists. If you can answer them, great. If you can't, don't feel like you have to. I know you're answering questions live and texting and typing, so don't feel the pressure to do that. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. But this one is for all of you, and there's some. What they are interested in is I'd be happy to hear pet peeves, bad patterns you've noticed on applications, things to avoid, tips like that. So we're talking about, at first we talked about like, here's how to build a relationship. Now this one is like, here's what not to do, or here's some things to, that just don't work for us. So Chanel, maybe you'll start us out.
Sure. I think for myself, being on the latter part of it, when I used to write proposals for the nonprofit I worked for, I was so focused on bringing the point home and bringing in so much data and so many numbers and so much information that I think it overtook my proposal, and it more so became confusing. So I think it's very important to answer your why. Why am I asking for this funding in the first place? Drive that message home, but don't do it chaotically. Being straight to the point, getting the information that you need there, so that when we're reading applications, it's not so busy and overwhelming. Because I have read applications that it's like they have so much going on and so many ideas that if you would have just focused on one and started from there and branched out, that would have been a better proposal, in my opinion. And so focusing on what is your why are we here? Why do we need the funding? And honing in on that, and not causing confusion. So I know it's hard to do that because you want to let the reviewer know what it is that you need and why you need it. And girl, we need this funding ASAP because X, Y, and Z. We get it. We've been there, but just make sure that you're doing it in a way that it's not causing confusion. And I'm not looking at 8 applications in one. It's one very specific application. You're driving the point home, and I can read through it seamlessly. And I'll also say too, our organization comes from a standpoint of, we know that a lot of Native farmers and ranchers and producers may not have the access to a grant writer. So they might be utilizing themselves. They might be utilizing small staff. So we're not looking so much as, and this is not the same for every organization. So don't take this as it's going to be the same, because it won't be. But for our organization specifically, we're not dinging you for I guess like punctuation and run-on sentences and things of that nature. We understand the demographic. We understand the individuals we're looking for to apply for our funding, and we know that some might not have professional grant writers. However, on that second note, though, just be sure to drive the point home and make it clear and concise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Brandon?
Data is important. Chanel alluded to that, but there's a point where there can be such thing as data. I think, a lot of times people get lost in trying to balance this need to demonstrate through data the validity of their programs and losing sight of the story. To me, a lot of this work is also telling that story. I mean, of course, have the data and metrics that show the results. Really focus on when your application, make sure you're aligned. If there's a specific strategy within the foundation, make sure you understand what that is and how your work fits there. As Chanel said, don't have 8 applications in one, but don't lose sight of the story. When I think about some of the common, and this also kind of goes back into relationship building, make sure you tell that story as well. You want to do it on paper, you want to do it within the application, you want to do it in the partnership. I was sitting in a class last week in a grad school program, and it was actually an ethics class. And we talked about ethical leadership. And the professor was showing all this research on how rational human beings aren't rational when it comes to certain things. The majority of things, we make decisions off of emotions. And so often we get lost on telling that story because we want to hit people over the head with so much data. And that should be the last thing when you're trying to convince somebody, really, like we're emotional beings, and you tell that story first and then back up that work with your data and your outcomes. And the last thing I'll hit on is just thinking about the development of metrics. There are times when people approach this work and they might be starting a new program or not have a lot of data or resources available to really tell that story. And some of that work is also thinking about how do you create metrics to create outputs and outcomes that are strong, like demonstrate how you're going to do the work, what you're going to accomplish from your efforts, and making sure that that's robust enough to achieve impact in a way that foundations, Grantmakers achieve.
Thank you so much. I just got back from a training Friday. I was in Alaska doing a training, and we were talking about just this very topic around what kind of data are funders looking for and how do we balance the data with the story about, because sometimes we just get, like you said, like you both said, we get so data driven that you're like, well, who do you serve and who are those individuals and what are they experiencing? So if anybody's out there watching this panel, see, this is what we talked about. And both of you, thank you for bringing that forward. Sushma, anything you'd like to add to this topic around, data and also, what was the original question?
It was really about sort of best practice, if you will.
Pet peeves. That's right.
Yeah, pet peeves. You framed it as pet peeves. So it's funny that you asked this of funders. I would actually say it's the other way around. Like, what are the pet peeves that grantees have about funders? And there's actually folks that you could follow on social media. It's called crappy funding practices. And you can turn in the funders who are asking for huge amounts of paper for small amounts of money, or creating huge restrictions on how the funds can be used. So I think that's really important for us to call out in the sector, the disproportionate amount of work that organizations have to do to jump through hoops to get, small amounts of funding, and how that really limits our ability to get our work done, our impact, and so on. So the Heising-Simons Foundation, we've really tried to think about how to right-size this process, to be in trusting relationship with our grantees, and thinking about ways in which we can accept information that is not just like a grant proposal with very stringent sets of questions and a long reporting requirements. So, for example, we might take a combination of an annual report, materials that have been presented to other funders, and so on. So we'd really try and think about how to expedite the grant process from the perspective of the grant recipient, right? While still doing your due diligence. And I think that's where funders should really be thinking about, like, how do we achieve impact? Part of it is like how much of your grantees' efforts are going to comply with grant requirements, and are we funding the full cost? I think there was a question that you were wanting to ask also about sort of overhead, right? Like, people always want to know, what do funders cover? And so I think it's really incumbent on funders to be honest about what it takes to make social change happen and to support the full cost of such efforts.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing that topic up about overhead. I think that's maybe that's something that we could address next, because I think, as we all know, and as a nonprofit, we've got to cover those administrative expenses. And yet there's oftentimes with some funders, I'm not saying you all, there's that kind of restriction around either we don't do general operating funds, or there's a ratio or a percentage of what needs to go to direct programming and what can be accomplished with general operating, and how to make that compelling. So I don't know if any of you would like to weigh in on that topic that Sushma just raised, because it did come up in the questions that were submitted numerous times. So maybe Chanel, I'll start with you, see if you have check in and see if you have from your organization's perspective.
We do have a cap, but I can't remember off the top of my head right now what it looks like. But we also understand that there is a need to do the work, and some of the programming that we've put out. So we encourage farmers and ranchers and tribes to submit us with programming efforts they would like to see. So there might be a special emphasis category, and we'll see this coming through and we'll say, you know what, we're going to fund this special emphasis category next year in our RFA, because the people have spoken and this is what they'd like to see. So we've had, for example, we've had beginning farmer and rancher as one of our special emphasis category. If you're just starting up, if you need to buy equipment, if you need to pay staff to start your farming and ranching efforts up, then we understand that your budget isn't going to be solely doing, in the dirt. You're not in the dirt yet. You're building your foundation. And so we understand that. So we take a look at it from that perspective and that point of view. And also just going back to what Sushma said about the I want to know what that website is, Sushma. I'd love to dabble and see what comments are made. But our organization provides feedback, and I know that it is not always the case.
True.
So you are able to, if you apply for our funding and you don't get funded, you can request a call with us, and we'll go over your application, and we'll go over why it seemed so busy and what we think you can do for the next year's application, and give you tips and pointers. As long as we're in our closed period of funding, we're not in the open RFA, we'll provide that feedback and that information to you. But yeah, so just back to the amount of kind of salary and looking at that, we take a look at the project and the work that they're doing. If they're already a grantee that's applied for funding through us, and it's, they're on their third year of funding, we might look at it a little differently and say, well, gosh, they've had their foundational year. They've built this program. They have other entities that they've tapped into funding for. We'd like to see more of this funding go directly out to the work, go directly out to the farming and ranching community in those efforts. So we might have comments or feedback on how to adjust the budget.
Got it.
Case by case, I guess, basis.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was like, it feels like one of the emerging topics from our conversation today is about relationship. That yes, there are, some tips and things of this nature, but it really does come back to, each one of you is different, and we're humans, and we want to. There's an interaction that happens, and historically, it's been like grantmaker here, grantee here, and what we're really talking about, what Sushma's brought up, and you all are addressing progressing. It's like, no, there's a relationship that's being built between both. And so I'm really appreciating where this is going. Brandon, how about you and your foundation around general operating funds and applications?
Yeah, great question. And from the community foundation perspective, we're always balancing this, this will of having discretionary funding and then non-discretionary funding. Mm-hmm. So with our non-discretionary funding, we have over 700 funds here that members, that community members and different folks have placed here. And sometimes they have specific restrictions. Sometimes there's, funds that are only, general operating grants. Some are only programmatic. And then with our discretionary funding, when we have the privilege of having those funds to be able to make those decisions, typically it's about 15% for overhead for us. We have the ability, of course, to flex up and down, but just generally speaking, from our strategy and our thoughts on the work, when it comes to some of these programs, we want to fund the work that's happening and also understand the need, of course, locally to support the operations. So a lot of times we'll seek to partner with some of our local funders to figure out who's funding what, because a lot of times there's a lot of crossover. So if somebody's funding more general ops, then we'll focus on the programmatic work and vice versa. So it just depends on the fund, if it's discretionary funding or not. History, of course, outcomes, past outcomes within the work, and honestly, just making an informed decision. We've seen a lot of examples. Think about just I've been sitting in the seat for 7 months now, and after kind of doing a review of the past 5 years of grant making, you see a lot of examples where there are some places where you're funding some of this work from a general operating standpoint. Next thing you know, you've got $1 million budget and $850,000 are going towards staff salaries, and none of it's going to programmatic work. And we're trying to prevent that from happening. So from our standpoint, 15% is roughly that cap, but we do reserve the right to flex.
Great, thank you. So this feels like a good segue into this next. There's like two questions that I'm going to combine a little bit. And it has to do with innovation and technology. So there's general operating, right? The money, the bread and butter money we need to keep the organization going. And then we as nonprofits, especially in this world that we're living in, there's the doing the work as usual, but there's also new and innovative projects, not organizations. But let's say I've been around an organization that's been around. And that balance between how do we invest in innovation versus what we've been doing and what actually works. And from your foundation's perspective, what suggestions or what information, or how do you make a strong case maybe from your perspective about something that an organization wants to try that's innovative, or a new technology that's emerging that they think might address an organizational or a community issue. So I'm going to start with you, Chanel, and then go to Sushma and then Brandon.
Gosh, ours is interesting because we're agriculture focused. So we've had a lot of entities come to us and say regenerative ag is a really big issue right now in agriculture, but looking to see how we can get innovative and creative with any agriculture projects has been, honestly, this year has been really eye-opening for us. So we were able to attend the Farm Bureau convention this last year, and they shared with us that some farmers and ranchers are utilizing drones to look at their crops. Some farmers and ranchers are utilizing bots to go through and to help with their row crops. So we're trying to look at our funding now in that perspective of, we want to encourage innovation and we want to encourage individuals to think outside of the box, because that could maximize their impact of funding when they're looking for other entities to fund them. So now that kind of opens them up to a different world of funding. We also talk about maximizing, this is just in terms of funding, we're not able to fund sole farmers and ranchers. So if you're a single producer, our organization can't fund you. However, if you're partnered up with a 501c3, a tribe, a CDFI, or an educational institution, that might look different. What we're trying to encourage individuals to do is we're able to fund entities that can then in turn fund sole producers. So we have a multitude of grantees that directly are giving funds and loans, distributing loans out to sole producers. we fund that entity, and then we encourage some of our other grantees to go seek out that funding if they're a sole producer. So we're trying to get creative and find ways even where we see gaps, or where we see, because of our trust agreement, we're only able to support these 4 categories. How can we also get other people involved that we're unable to directly impact in terms of our funding? So I think it's opening your mind to that creativity and that innovation, and farming and ranching doesn't look the same as it used to, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so opening our minds and educating ourselves as a funder of how we can see it growing for each of our projects and grantees, and us getting the mindset to encourage that to continue to happen.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Sushma?
Well, I think there's so much to cover here. I'm just wondering also about the questions in the chat and whether I should get to any of those. I feel like I've answered a lot of these, but I just want to make sure I'm not. How
we like to do the panels is we do the questions live, and I'm culling through them and trying to get the ones that are for the general group. And then, so don't feel any pressure to answer the ones in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah,
you have a moderator who's trying to get
wonderful.
To them. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I just want to make sure.
It's a lot to manage. Yes.
It is a lot to manage. It's so wonderful. Thank you again.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to touch on. I'll just touch on a couple of things. Again, each foundation is different, coming back to the question of, what Brandon had talked about in terms of sort of the budgets and the kind of overheads. I think in our case, we often fund general support. And so for us, what that means is we're not tying our funding to a particular line item, and that allows our grantees some of the flexibility where, there may be some funders who aren't funding that overhead cost, but they need to pay the rent or pay for staffing. And there are some cases where certain projects are resource intensive or staff intensive. So, I think it's that conversation with the funder. And then on the innovation front, I would say, what's the reason? What's the why behind this, right? So many people talk about innovation. So is it to improve like your programs and services? Is it because your ecosystem in which you're working, there's some major changes that are happening? Are there changes in the political environment that affect your mission, purpose? Are there funding trends that are happening that require you to pivot? So what's the reason behind this innovation need? Is it, and where is it coming from? And that could then help position you to think about how do you build that knowledge internally? How do you build the resources, as opposed to just chasing innovation for the sake of being innovative?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Brandon?
We live in this interesting point in time. It seems like every other day there's something new that's happening, some new technology that's coming to fruition. But sometimes, in my personal opinion, and this is Brandon and not necessarily the foundation, innovation can be found in some of the things that we've known and done and just doing them better, right? Mm-hmm. I think about, we as much as we know from the aspect of the neuroscience of education and how the brain works, and the fact that we still have communities, we still have schools that do not teach children how to read based off of the science of reading that has been vetted, researched. We know, right? It's one of the ways and one of the reasons why Mississippi has gone from, last when it comes to reading and literacy to somewhere middle of the pack, because all of a sudden they made a policy choice to start teaching reading across the state using the science of reading, right? So sometimes innovation is going back and doubling down on what we know actually works, that's vetted in research, that's empirically vetted. The second part of my question, and the second part of my answer maybe lends itself to a little bit of social capital. I don't know. But for a lot of work we seek to do is how do we get closest to the people who are most impacted by what's happening, right? How do we get close to communities? Because a lot of the innovation that comes into fruition can be guided by those who are dealing with these, issues in their everyday life. So finding, extending our social capital in any way, shape, or form to figure out how to connect with these folks to uplift the innovations that they see. When you think about climate control, there are things that indigenous people have been doing, for years and years and years that do more to mitigate climate changes than anything we are developing in the tech scene, right? But Do they have the social capital to have those solutions rise up to the top and get vetted and be amplified? No. So a lot of that time also when it comes to, seeding or creating innovation is, for us to make sure we extend our social capital and go to where the innovation is happening, make sure we're doing our best to amplify it. And can't speak enough about doing what works. There's some things that we know, like the wheel is round for a reason. We don't need to create a wheel. Sometimes it's just doubling down on some of the things that we know are, proven empirically.
Thank you for that. This question came in advance and it comes up sometimes. So I want to ask this question to you all. So it was on the questions that I shared with you. So recently I attended a GPA forum about AI and things like Grammarly. I'm curious what Grantmakers are seeing and experiencing regarding AI and where the line is between seeing it as a equity tool versus quote unquote cheating. So I'm wondering any of y'all's thoughts on that. Sushma, will you start us off?
Yeah, in fact, I asked a couple of my colleagues internally about this question, and we didn't have an answer as such. So I think we don't have a policy on it as of this moment. I think, organizations are free to use it as they see fit. I will just say more from my personal experience, the use of some of these tools, the language seems a bit generic at times. And of course, we've heard of the inaccuracies and racial biases that are baked into some of these tools. And finally, the environmental footprint of some of these tools in terms of the water, the electricity usage, and so on. So I think it's not a one size fits all. And I don't think it's really the panacea for us because part of it is us thinking like, what is the best way to accomplish social change? We've all touched on the relational aspects of fundraising that go well beyond a proposal that's churned out by a machine. So, bringing that nuance, bringing that sophistication, bringing that relational self to these conversations, I think is really important. And I think will continue to be the case.
Thank you. Brandon?
I had a big smile on my face because this is something we've been talking about. I'm in a grad school program, working on another graduate degree. And I've had professors who have said, embrace it, use AI, use all the chatbots, use everything you can. And I have other professors who say, absolutely not, we're totally against it. And if you do, we have this other AI that can detect it. And yet everybody in the class uses it and nobody ever gets in trouble, right? I see it like this. For me, I think about this in the aspect of what tool can give you a competitive advantage. I don't consider it cheating, right? Just for those who might have seen my LinkedIn post, the LinkedIn post I made about this event, I used Microsoft Copilot. I put a link to the post and said, create a post publicizing this thing, and boom, 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 read it, copied and paste, right? I have a cohort member who literally cuts down on about 4 or 5 hours of work by setting up bots to do work when it comes to the research and the readings that we have, to formulate opinions and help him move quickly. So I don't see it as cheating. I see it as trying to figure out how to gain competitive advantage. Now, but we have to be aware of the dissemination of it and who uses it, right? So on our side, we also have to make sure that when you have an application, you have a document that looks polished, it looks clean and looks great, regardless of whether you think AI uses it or not. You have one, like Chanel said, that might not be as polished, that you still take as much passion to the one that might not be as polished to the one that is. Make sure you're running it through the same foundational principles, making sure it's aligned, making sure your process is ethical. A lot of time, I think about sitting in a seat like this where your job is not only to figure out who to partner with, it's also how do you help organizations, improve, right? Testament, I think, and I can speak for myself, but I think a testament to this work is also seeing somebody who comes through a process. They might not be ready, they might not get funded, or maybe they do, right? But you're also saying, hey, you got to get much more tighter so you can go get bigger opportunities. How can we go from the community foundation of Greater Greensboro then to talking to Sushma or to talking to Chanel and have even bigger or better opportunities, right? So using whatever tools you can also in the aspect of developing is important. I think a lot of the AI and technology we have, it democratizes the process, and that's a good thing, right? Because, you know, as people know, this industry has had issues when it comes to power, when it comes to social capital, when it comes to extending ourselves to folks that might not look like us or might not come from the same economic backgrounds as us. So whatever we can do to democratize this and make it a more equitable process, I'm all in favor. So if you're applying to CFGG and you use AI, like, we're not going to penalize.
Thank you. Good for y'all who are out there in North Carolina. Okay, Chanel, how about you?
I think my only comment is just that I totally in agreement with Sushma and Brandon. It's just we're in an interesting day and age now. We don't have a policy on utilizing those tools. I will say, from our perspective, just don't lose the authenticity of your voice in the application. And I think that does get lost if you completely utilize ChatGPT or whatever other resources. I think it's okay to potentially use it as a foundation to maybe carve out your application and say, these are some of the things I want to put in my application, but just don't lose that authenticity and that and letting us, the reader, know, you know, why it is that you're applying. And there are pros and there are cons, but that just would be my suggestion.
Thank you. So we've been focused really a lot on the application. I want to zoom us out a little bit and hear from you all as philanthropists. So I'm curious, and Chanel, we're going to start with you. I'm curious about from a philanthropist perspective or from a funding perspective, what are some of the challenges that your foundations are facing in this changing world? We've been talking a lot about how it's a very unique time in history. Some of the comments are even saying at this moment in history, a lot of the things that have been happening. But what are some of the challenges or maybe even opportunities that you all are seeing as philanthropists from your perspective?
I think there are unique opportunities for us now to gear our organization into utilizing some of the AI tools. So that's been a hot topic for our organization in terms of thinking about our reporting systems. We utilize Foundin on the back end. So Foundin is where you would go in to apply for our application. It's our in-house, and we're thinking about how can we better manage and have quicker turnaround, and noticing that some of our grantees, they maybe in some cases are not wanting the face-to-face communications. They're wanting to type in a question and pull it up on our website, and that might be easier for them than to go through an email, set up a call. So we're now in this interesting state of how do we utilize those tools, and what is going to be the most impactful for the people that we're serving? What are the pros and cons to that? And so, like I said, we're a private charitable trust. We're a drawdown trust. So we'll only be around for about 20 more years of funding. And so we know that we've got to kind of acclimate to the changes and do what's best for our the individuals we're serving, but also what's best for our organization and why we were created. Why did we start? Why are we here? So there's just some big conversations, I think, that we have had as a whole in terms of how we can best serve our individuals and what that looks like. So still divvying that out, but a lot of it has been centered around utilizing outside tools or outside contractors and what that might mean for our organization in the long run.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sushma?
This is a really big and complex question. I'll just touch on a couple of things. I'll say that I'll start with some of the challenges first to get the depressing stuff out of the way. But I think we are living in a very perilous political time. And I think that we are facing rollbacks of progress that has taken place. And we have seen this throughout our history. Progress that occurs then is met with resistance and rollbacks. And this is happening at a variety of levels. You're looking at what's happening in higher education. You're looking at what's happening in terms of using the law as a tool to roll back rights, but using the language of rights. And so I think it is incumbent on philanthropy to really think about how do you advance opportunity in an environment like this. If the role of philanthropy is to really address social challenges, create a healthy, vibrant civil society, an inclusive democracy, what is our role at this time? And how do we bring people together in support of a broader common good? One where everyone can participate and be included and be championed. And, how do you think about equity in a particular context like this? So that would be sort of number one on my mind. And it's both a challenge and an opportunity. I think there's so much we can learn from in terms of the groups on the ground, whether it's social movements, academics, litigators. There are a lot of people we can seek inspiration from and listen to. I think, one of the things I embarked on a year ago was this sort of listening and learning session, because I think funders don't do enough of that. You tend to be the loudest voice in the room. So really sort of pausing and saying, we want to listen, we want to hear, we want to understand. We don't have all the answers. So I think that's really important at this time of political peril. I think the second I would say is that irrespective of what our foundations focus on, we are looking at an environment where there are big, complex issues we are tackling, right? Whether we foundations tackle it or not. Climate, we've touched on this. The status of indigenous communities. We've talked about AI, and no one institution can tackle these things. So I think there's an opportunity here for funders to be in collaboration with other funders, but also in conversation with the organizations on the front lines. And then when appropriate, in conversation with government. So for example, the Heising-Simons Foundation is part of a collaborative on trustworthy AI that was set up by the Office of the Vice President. So it's like a White House initiative on AI, and it brought together several foundations that are part of a loose-knit collaboration to work together. So I think collaboration is really important to be able to tackle some of these big issues. And then finally, I think taking perspective. I know we often are like, oh my God, the current moment is really stressful. This is unlike any other time. Well, no. I mean, if we think back on the late 1800s and what was happening, or if we think back on the 1960s and what was happening, there are moments in our history where we can pause and draw on strength of those who've come before us and learn lessons from them and realize that this process of change is long-term process, and there are periods of rollback and there are periods of progress. And our job is to kind of keep the long-term view while we are focused on the short term.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So rich. I want to go into several of the things that you said. Brandon.
Chanel talked a little bit about serving, your constituencies, passionately and on purpose and with intent, being intentional. And Sushma talked a lot about the externalities that create some of these issues and the complexity of creating solutions and collaboration. For me, I think about some of this work, not about doing things in an innovative way, but trying to do things differently, right? I'm fortunate enough to be deploying capital across the spectrum of impact. So we're thinking about philanthropy, thinking about grant making dollars, also thinking about how do we use, and a lot of foundations do this work, right? But how do we use our capital, our assets differently, right? So for example, we have a really huge housing issue like many cities across the country. Not enough supply, not enough attainable supply, not enough affordable homes. And then when you start talking about affordable homes, everybody's for it until they go, not in my backyard. Even if it's mixed income, they say, not in my backyard. No. It's always good for other people until it touches us, right? And there's this aspect of, providing, grants to churches and faith-based institutions to figure out how to develop property and create more attainable mixed income housing. There's also work that we're pushing and starting to lean into around how do we as a foundation become the acquirer, the folks who rehab, and then the folks who develop and manage property as well? What does it look like for us to go buy 100 units in Greensboro. Make sure that they are rehab that, 15 to 20K a door. Make sure they're livable, they're nice, they're beautiful. Make sure that we're not concentrating poverty into certain areas. And also this aspect of impact investing, right? Doing good and doing well. Right? What does a market rate return look like? So that is also, attractive to those on the investment committee. They go, I don't know about this impact thing because it's only a 2% return. It's like, no, that's actually not it, right? So I think, figuring out how to deploy capital differently. A lot of times we stay in this frame of, all right, we only have philanthropy and we keep the capital, we keep our assets separate, right? And, that's by design in many ways, but there are places where I think about, we're an organization, our endowment's $300 million. Do a lot of foundations, especially those that are larger, like, do they really need to have a market rate return on the last, $1 million on the books, right? Can you put that to work in a different way? That's not traditional asset allocation. And in many cases you can, and it won't do anything to your payouts. So a lot of the work we're thinking about is like, what other tools can we put out of the toolkit? What other types of capital can we deploy? I think a lot of times we also lose sight of, the work when it comes to advocacy as well. I'm a big fan of advocacy, right? When you talk about large scale sustainable change, or at least sustainable change by certain folks who are in office, we can go one by one and do certain things, but if we can get a policy change that then, reaches a multitude of people, that can be a good thing if it's done right. Don't call a community organization and say, we need you to show up to the state capitol with 40 people in your green shirts in the last minute when you didn't have them involved in the policy drafting. You hadn't involved them the entire time. So that partnership with communities is key to make sure it's aligned, but making sure you use every single tool in the toolkit is super important to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like we just opened a whole window of topics that we could just go for the next 30 minutes and talk about. I want to thank you all for that. There was so much richness, and I think encouragement also from a grant seeker's perspective is to hear about what you all are wrestling with in terms of the work that you do in the innovations, and forget that word innovations, just the things that you're wrestling with, topics that you're wrestling with and how you're thinking about it. We're at the top of the hour, in fact, a few minutes over anyways. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank everybody for submitting the questions. We got to, our panelists even were responding to some of them, even though they didn't have to. And I thank them for doing that. And I thank you all of the attendees for joining us again. You will all be receiving a follow-up email with this recording, as well as the date for our next funder panel. And we hope that you'll join us. I want to just really quickly, I love to let you all have like the last word. If you want to go around each one, we'll start with Chanel. And just one final word of closing departure for our viewers.
Sure. Just thank you so much for giving us your time today. I know that there were quite a few questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure we'll, Angela, you can share those with us and we can answer best as we can later. But just my perspective from this whole conversation today is just, like I said earlier, being authentic in your applications, in your proposals, doing the outreach that you need to do, finding the grants that are going to be impactful and not just applying because it's good money, but making sure that it's something that is going to be reflective of your mission, of your organization. I'm happy to answer any questions specific to Native American Agriculture Fund. Like I said, there's somebody specifically on our team that will field any questions, any emails that come in, and they'll get them to the right department. So again, thank you all for your time, and really thank you for doing the work in this country and making the wheels go round in the philanthropy world. And good luck in all of your endeavors.
Thank you. Sushma?
Well, thank you so much. My closing thoughts are really to approach the work that you each do with a sense of hope and possibility. So often we focus our efforts on describing the challenges, the problems, the deficits, and really, I think coming to it from an asset-based, aspirational lens can help us find a sense of shared purpose and meaning.
Thank you. Brendan?
Like to say thank you to everyone involved in setting this up. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. For me, there are a couple of things that come to mind. I'll be brief. One, never lose sight of the humanity that is involved in this work. Oftentimes we get in the mix, we have deadlines, we have work we're doing, and we forget, or we tend to not focus on the fact that we are human beings and life happens. So no matter how difficult the road gets or how high the valley may be, like live in that moment and really like recognize the humanity that connects us all. Two, really grateful for all the efforts you all are working on. We live in a place where we don't have a multitude of resources. At times we're bound by a number of budget or something, and we'd love to fund so many things, but we have to, figure out which is most aligned, most impactful from our organization's standpoint. That doesn't mean we don't value you or value your work. So if I can ever be a partner, no matter what it is, whether you're in Greensboro, Guilford County or not, I can be a thought partner, can be helpful. Feel free to reach out. I still maintain my open door policy at all times. I just love meeting new people and connecting and just hearing and learning from you all who are in the mix, in the fight, really doing great work on behalf of those you serve. So thank you for your efforts and thank you all.
Thank you. And thank you all of you again. There's a lot of thank yous coming in the Q&A. Thank you all of you for attending. And again, I want to thank our sponsors, Grant Station and Foundant Technologies. The Grantsmanship Center is so proud and so honored to be able to host these conversations once a quarter. So we'll see you next time, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.